Good evening, and welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. In keeping with our mission to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement, tonight we return to the continuing war in Ukraine and our conversation with foreign policy, Ukraine, and Russia experts, Professors Oksana Shevel and Timothy Frye, and our moderator, Gideon Rose. While campaigning, President Trump said he would end the war on day one. Clearly, it's proven to be far more complex than he imagined. And as America appears to be shrinking away from the world stage, Europe seems to be rising to fill the void. As usual, tonight's update is well timed. Please visit our website, nfrpp.org, to read our experts' extensive bios and see their recent publications. At NFRPP, we believe that exploring complex issues is at the root of finding solutions, making meaningful change, fostering understanding, and finding common ground. If you agree with our mission, please consider supporting our work. Please visit our website to learn more. Our audience represents all sides of the political spectrum, which always results in a lively Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will respond to as many as time allows. Please note, your questions may not appear on your screens, but don't worry, we can see them. Gideon, Oksana, and Timothy, thank you for being with us again tonight. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you, Tim and Oksana, and to all of you helping to organize this. These are incredibly interesting, dangerous, horrible, appalling times. Not just in our, it's clearly been so for people who study Eastern Europe and Russia and the area around there, and it has become so for everybody else recently as well. And what's interesting now is how crazy all the technocrats are in every sphere, from public health to economic policy, from security policy to trade policy. All of our various technocratic and public policy friends are tearing their hair out and trying to figure out what is going on in a world in crisis where we are the chief source of crisis and Washington is the chief source of uncertainty. So we're going to play this out now. We've had a very stable situation for the last few of these calls, and now things are anything but stable. So let's try to figure out where things are right now, and then we can get to explaining what the hell is going on and why. But let's first just get a situation update. So the two of you, what is the situation on the ground in the war itself, militarily, compared to when we last met? In other words, how stable is the military situation and what is it? Or what is it and how stable?
Oksana, do you want to go first or you're muted?
Oh, sorry, I meant to say, go ahead, I'll go after you.
Okay. No, so depending on where you look, Russia continues to make small, small gains over a kind of a broad front. No signs of a great breakthrough. The Ukrainian forces that invaded into Russia and took parts of Kursk region have given up some territory, including one town recently. They, despite claims from President Putin and from the U.S. envoy that the troops were encircled by Russians and about to be slaughtered, lo and behold, that information turned out to be untrue. Most people expect the fighting to intensify as the weather gets better and spring comes. But I still think the odds for a kind of Russian breakthrough still seem pretty low. There was a new casualties figure from Russia, on the order of 900,000 soldiers, with roughly 250,000 killed. So the
You believe
losses
that?
are just staggering. That's what a NATO official reported. So that's higher than I think most estimates, but even conservative estimates, put it, well north of 500,000. And, if we think of Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, where 15,000 troops died in a country that was 1.5 times larger than contemporary Russia, in a war that lasted 10 years, you get a sense of the scale of the losses. At the same time, those losses don't seem to be having much of an impact on decision making in the Kremlin, don't seem to be having a big impact on public opinion, although I've done some research that I could talk about later and go into more detail. But that's the kind of broad strokes. Russia feels like it's on the front foot right now.
Well, that, by the way, I heard that their finances, if you had kept up things for another year, their financial situation would start to look really pretty grim later in the year. Is that true?
Yeah, that's about right. But for the short term, things don't look bad. And, as we know from yesterday's announcement, the end of the year is a very long time away,
Right, right.
and a
But I'm
lot
saying
of
in
things are
theory.
going to happen between now and then. But the notion that Russia would be able to continue its relatively stable but slow growth seems unlikely. And one comparison point is Kazakhstan, which was not involved in a war in Ukraine, which continues to grow at a faster rate than Russia, with a not too dissimilar economy.
So Kazakhstan is what Russia would look like without
Yeah, I
the
mean,
war.
that's kind of the closest comparison, probably.
I like that. That's interesting. I'll steal
Yeah.
that. Okay, Oksana, over to you on Ukraine. What's the Ukraine side up to?
I second everything Tim said, so I think he laid out the most important facts. I would sort of invite everybody to think of kind of the broader, I don't know if we call it the game of chicken in the game theoretical terms, but I think what I'm trying to get at here is that Russia is trying to present a view to the world, and I think it is succeeding, at least as far as convincing the Trump administration. That is basically like time is on its side and it cannot possibly lose. And you may as well sort of hurry up and settle now, because over time things would only get worse for Ukraine. And this is sort of the leverage here that Russia is using, is that it has obviously many more people, and that, its economy hasn't crumbled with sanctions. And basically, Putin, I think in Murmansk just a couple of days ago, said that Russian army can crush the Ukrainian army, right? And I think this is why we don't see Russia agreeing to the ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire on the current sort of line of conflict that Ukraine actually agreed to, because they don't think it serves their interests. They are perhaps themselves believing, or certainly trying to create the impression that they can keep pushing on. But this is where sort of the analytical kind of questioning would come in, because I think once you start looking at sort of specific events on the battlefield and in the economy, the picture at least becomes more mixed and potentially actually not nearly as advantageous to Russia as it's trying to present. So there are a few facts I would sort of throw in here for the audience members to reflect on. So, for example, Ukraine now produces, I believe, around 40% of its own arms, right, which was quite different from the beginning of the war. So, not to say that US aid is not important, it clearly is very important. But, the Ukraine now feels that they have the capacity, especially with European aid, to not accept detrimental deal, because they can actually keep fighting. Yes, they can't reclaim the territory, but, as Tim said, there is no Russian breakthrough. In fact, I was just reading yesterday some military analysis that compares territory Russia gained, and actually the territorial gains have slowed. Like last month, they captured less territory than they captured in any months since previous summer, right? So this sort of like, I want to use the term gaslighting, Russia is trying to present itself as this kind of invincible force. I think on the battlefield, it's a little bit maybe more questionable, right? So Ukrainian, apparently again, military analysts saying Its training of the troops have somewhat improved. The drone warfare is very important. Ukraine now has a thriving domestic drone industry. So it basically means, again, if we sort of reflect on the prospect of negotiation, that each side thinks that it can actually, it doesn't have to settle for the terms that are disadvantageous, because over time they actually might be better than the opposing side. And I think this is, why we don't have the ceasefire that President Trump wanted in 24 hours from taking office or whatever the timeline was, because Russians think they can gain more, right? And Ukraine would not fall. We'll probably get to discussing this, to the terms that are completely disadvantageous, especially as far as its sovereignty, its military capacity, because they think, over time they can actually continue to withstand. So
Okay.
In
that's something.
general, and in general, the defense has an advantage. I think there's this notion that Russia has more people and more resources, so eventually it's going to just grind Ukraine down. But typically you'd like to have a 3-to-1 advantage of offense against defense. And Russia's never come close to an advantage of that size. So
But at the
kind
same
of
time, the perception is also important, because Russia seems
critical.
trying hard to convince, in particular, Trump administration, and this whole narrative that how Zelensky, quote unquote, has no cards, right?
Yeah.
So they may be succeeding in creating this image, even though analytically speaking, it may not be fully accurate, or perhaps not accurate at all.
Okay, so Oksana, actually on that front, let me just take a follow-up, which is if the Ukrainians are in better position than is being portrayed by Russia and Washington, what would it take either from the US or if not from the US, from Europe to keep them in the game?
Well, I think one thing that Ukrainians are hoping, I think Zelensky just said it again today, that there should be put more pressure on Russia to actually, it is saying it wants peace, right? Like respond to these ceasefire
Right.
proposals. And
I know that. We assume Russia is everything you said and assume that it's not going to change, which is both good assumptions, right? So then the pressure is there's simply no way that the Trump administration is going to put pressure on Russia to get it to give in less. So the only question is, will Ukraine hold out with, how much will Ukraine be able to hold out for what? And my question to you is, what will Ukraine need, in addition to what it has itself, from here to be able to hold out against Russia?
yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I would push back a little bit against it, because I think Trump, being as volatile as he is, I mean, I think it's unlikely, that he will put pressure on Russia, but I don't think it's completely out of the question. There was already some sign that he's very angry at Putin for proposing some, whatever it was, some UN management of Ukraine or what have you. So, there is a little question mark. Trump might lose patience. So Russia, in a way, could overplay its hand. I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. But sort of short of that, like what Ukraine concretely needs, I think, again, the economic and military aid that comes from US, of course, is important, but also what comes from the EU is important. And again, as Tim is saying, kind of defense is cheaper than in offense, both in sort of material terms and military terms. So they are trying to, for example, prevent any kind of breakthrough in Donbass. It seems like they've been successful. I mean, this town of Pokrovsk has been on the verge of falling since August, right? And it's nowhere near falling. Right. So this sort of again, if more time goes by and Ukraine is able to prevent the front from collapsing, to prevent the economy from collapsing with Western, in particular European aid, right? Maybe the hope on the Ukrainian side is that over time it would become maybe more clear, at least to Trump, if not to Putin, that Russia doesn't actually have the capacity to overcome Ukraine this way. And by not agreeing to the ceasefire, it's actually them who are the obstacle to peace more than Ukraine, right? And maybe then there would be more pressure on Russia. I mean, we are sort of not there yet. But I think this sort of, continued domestic reform as far as military industrial complex continued, at least European aid, and of course, ideally also US aid. And then with a hope that in a few months, or maybe sooner, there would be realization that really, it's not Zelensky that stands in the way of peace, but it is Putin who is hoping to kind of get more than what they now have and puts all these conditions on ceasefire and so forth.
Okay, so let's go to round two, Trump. What is Trump's rationale? We know what Trump's behavior toward the conflict is. What we don't know is what is really going on behind that, like why that behavior is occurring and what the future will be. So, assuming that we generally have all watched the same news and know what the situation is for how the administration has behaved, Tim, what is your explanation for why they behave this way, and what do you expect going forward?
So it was in your opening remarks, you talked about how we were in a completely different situation than we were the last time we met. And I would push back on that a little bit in that the dynamism for a ceasefire or a peace deal, it's not coming from Russia. That hasn't changed at all. The Ukrainians are maybe marginally more interested if a deal can be cut, but not a lot. The US side has changed, dramatically with the Trump to Biden switch. But what's driving Trump's behavior? And, it doesn't seem to be a strategic move that is being compelled by some change in the facts on the ground. It seems to be driven more by his belief that if he cuts a deal, he'll win a Nobel Prize. He'll be able to demonstrate that he's this great deal maker. You could tell a story that it's really about a pivot to China and that there's some deeper rationale here. I'm not quite sure that's right. The other argument would be, oh, that there's all these lucrative markets in Russia that, once U.S.-Russian relations are stabilized, there's going to be, a flourishing U.S.-Russia trade. And, we've heard that story since, well, my whole lifetime that, good economic relations are going to change fundamentally the U.S.-Russian relations. And that really hasn't happened. So as I see it, like it's really a weak read to be building a relationship on, which is really Trump's just personal desire to get an agreement. And we know that if you go into a negotiation being the one that really, really wants an agreement, the likelihood that you're going to get a good deal is not very high. So, as we talked about last time, I think Trump is in a similar situation where he can either be exposed as a very bad deal maker and sign something that, is seen as a capitulation, or he's going to be frustrated and not be able to come out with a deal. So I think, things have the froth, things at the top, the headlines have changed a lot, but the underlying dynamics, I think, are still pretty similar to where we were before.
Okay, before I get to what's
Yeah.
on that, I
Yeah.
want to press you. You haven't even addressed the more sinister or grander sort of potential
Yeah.
explanations of the pro-Russia tilt, that it's either, that it's either an authoritarian bromance or a deep affinity with Putin personally, or
Yeah.
part of some neo great power concert dividing up the world. Do you
I
buy
was
it?
being
Your
charitable. I'm
no,
trying
no,
to
no.
be.
Don't be charitable. Be accurate. Because there are people
Yeah.
who will say, look,
No,
this is
that's
a
right. No,
toddler
yeah.
and it's a toddler thing. You don't have to
Yeah.
have any explanation beyond that it's a toddler. But there are other
Yeah.
people who say, no, no, no. There's sinister Trump,
Yeah.
Russia loving Trump. There's, Agent Trump versus
Yeah.
authoritarian
No.
walk in fanboy Trump.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you
I mean,
buy any of that?
I don't buy the, Putin has compromat on Trump, or that this is all driven by Trump's personal desire to get rich in Russia and build the Trump Hotel in Moscow. I do, look, he Trump likes autocrats generally, not just Putin. But he's always had a notion that a successful presidency will involve a resetting of U.S.-Russia relations. I think that's an accurate statement. But, you know, that's, I think the more likely outcome is the North Korea outcome, where in Trump's first administration, he spent a lot of time and energy courting Kim Jong-un, and we're writing love letters to each other and all this kind of stuff. And then, he recognized that it's really hard and there are tectonic plates in international relations, and he got bored and then he moved on. So that's a possibility, a real possibility here.
Okay, this is fascinating, and we'll pick up on this.
Okay.
Oksana, your take on this. What is your model of Trump, and why is it, what does it
Yeah,
say to move
I
forward?
mean, I would echo a lot. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing that Trump may be like an agent Krasnov, right? There is compromat, or there is this sort of autocratic affinity at the heart of it. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, it seems like it's potentially plausible. Like, we don't have any evidence, right? That would be sort of hard evidence for it. But I think even that aside, I think Tim's point, which I fully agree with, I think Trump wanting a quick deal to claim himself a great deal maker, to potentially get Nobel Prize and sort of get himself a pat on the back. I think that even if nothing else is true, I mean, that by itself, I think goes a lot to explaining what we have seen, right? This pressure on, originally on Ukraine, because if you remember when Zelensky said something along the lines, which we, would agree here, that it's difficult to solve this conflict. Trump, like, basically flew off this rocket and withdrew aid for a week or whatever it was, right? And I think the question to my mind is like, who is he going to blame when it becomes clear, which I think is already becoming clear, that a quick deal is just not in the cards? This conflict is complex. There are underlying reasons we can get, talking into that, Tim and I have written about, but it's not something you can solve just sort of like in this quick, right? And then I think the question is, who does he blame? So far, it seems he blamed primarily Zelensky, that Zelensky was not willing, right? Like, now that I think the table is a little bit potentially turned to basically make it clear that really big obstacle is Putin and not Zelensky, right? He's not agreeing to the ceasefire, right? He's trying to create all these preconditions, all of this. And if Trump indeed decides, which he hasn't yet, but I think it's not impossible, that really Putin is standing in the way, right? And then he said he's going to punish him with whatever, like sanctions or something else, right? And then, as Tim is saying, he might just lose interest, right? If it sort of becomes clear that, like, you try to pressure one, you try to pressure the other, nobody's bulging, he may then outsource it to, aides, and we are going to have some protracted negotiation, maybe some sort of strategic, technical agreements on, not shooting here and there, but nothing by way of a comprehensive settlement, because there are serious obstacles. And I mean, this is ultimately irreconcilability of Ukraine and Russia's position as to the future of Ukraine. It's not about like where exactly the line would come. It is ultimately, is Ukraine a sovereign independent state that can do its own thing without looking, Russia dictating, or can it not be? That's really kind of at the core of it. And I don't think Trump thinks about it this way. He just wants a quick deal. So that's my reflection on
Okay,
this.
first of all, this is great. And I love hearing all you guys because you're so smart and you're so clear-headed and your analysis has proven so good. And it's so different, as we all know, from many of the analyses that are proffered out there. And nobody really knows what's going on, but your kind of sane take, it's very grounding. But here's a question now. Okay, let's assume we basically all agree on what you just said, sort of. And then the question becomes, okay, so what happens down the road? You said, Oksana, that you hoped there was here's three scenarios. One, he flips to peer pressuring Russia. Two, he loses interest but keeps the status quo as it is. Three, he loses interest and chooses to walk away, saying, you know what, Europe, screw you. You want this, you do it. We're just not giving anymore. And so US aid essentially peters out over the summer. So those are three different scenarios for the future, even assuming everything you're saying about where we are right now. So the two of you, what do you think of those three scenarios, and which do you think is likely when we have our next talk in the fall?
Say
So
again, what did you outline as three
So
scenarios?
one is Trump flips to being more pro-Biden like and pressuring Russia as well. Your positive scenario, hopeful when he realizes that it's the people denying him the deal are Russia. Second possibility, status quo, he gets the North Korea one that Tim laid out, which is he gets tired of trying to find a deal and you just end up going back to the old policy and forgetting about it, essentially. And the third one is not a North Korea one, but an abandonment one, which is he gets tired of trying to get a deal, realizes there's no deal to be had, but doesn't commit to continuing the status quo as in North Korea, but simply walks away from Ukraine and says, Europe, you want to supply, you and Oshana think you guys can do this together without the US? Fine, try. So we're not going to put any more pressure on, but we're out. Which of those happens, Tim?
So I would put my money more on 2 or 3 than on 1. And it might depend a lot on Trump's position vis-a-vis the Republican Party, which, the public opinion polls
Wait, who
suggest
are
that,
they?
um,
Is a
uh,
party? Fine.
I know, that's right. Well, I mean, this is the point is if if the Republican Party still is just an extension of Trump, then I think scenario 3 is really the most likely, where particularly the Vance wing just says, Ukraine doesn't matter. We need to focus on China. Um, you know, we know from Signalgate how Vance feels about Europe. So on the other hand, if it's the case that Trump's popularity goes down and the Senate starts to find its spine a little bit, the House starts to get worried about the midterm elections, then one could see a scenario where, yeah, Trump says, I'm not wasting my time anymore on this, and that there is a, coalition within the Republican Party that still supports Ukraine on the merits, in part because it's not necessarily a winning issue come 2026.
By the way, the
So,
logic of that, and I want to get to you today, but the logic of what you just said, Tim, is that these other events might be related to Ukraine because you can imagine a situation in which other events like tariffs and the political
yeah,
constraints people feel have already weakened his position with Republicans in Congress and therefore perhaps empowered some of those who might be able to stop him from a complete abandonment in return for getting that. So that
yes,
in effect, you could see links, even though not direct, between stuff like the tariff wars or Musk and Doge and Ukraine by way of going through his political support in Congress, and if that weakens the extent to which at least some pro-Ukraine people and anti-Russia people in Congress could have more of a voice than they have shown to date. Am I correct in that?
yeah. I mean, if you
Interesting.
think back to 2022, 2023, you had, overwhelming majorities of Republicans in both houses
Interesting.
supporting. So,
Interesting. Okay, that
anyway,
clever. I hadn't thought of that. I like
yeah.
that. I'm going to steal that too. You're going to make me all sound very smart. Sana, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I was sort of thinking, I'm trying to think through your search scenario, and I'm trying to wrap kind of my mind like about around it logically because this abandonment, right? The Trump walks away. It's like, is this really different from supporting Russia? Because to me, it's
Mm,
like, if you think what it really means, right? It really isn't just walking away and saying, I'm neutral in this. Like, it would de facto favor Russia, no question about it, right? And then I think we get into this question that Tim was raising.
mm,
Would, the Republican establishment, other people in the foreign policy community, what have you, on board with it? Because I don't think you can present it as just sort of neutral, like, I'm no longer party to this, right? Because I think then you would have to kind of have some set of arguments, which I would struggle to come up with, like how is that not just favoring Russia, right?
mm,
So that's kind of like I am kind of trying to think through that. But then if say there is something like this happens, right, and assuming perhaps that there isn't enough Republican pushback or they have longer time to organize, then I think the question becomes to what extent Ukraine can sustain itself with European support without the US support, right? And I'm not a military expert. Like, my sense is that there isn't, like, the imminent collapse is not in the cards, even in the worst case scenario, given again that Ukraine produces now close to half of its own arms, that Europeans supply like another 30%. So US is still very important, right? And I think what it might happen that, for example, the air defense missiles that protect Ukrainian cities, and Russia has been pounding the cities, right? So we are really talking about, it would sort of drive home, probably civilian casualties would escalate quite a bit if, say, Ukrainian missile defense is depleted and it's not being replenished by the US, and you have many more people getting killed in their bedrooms, right? Like, is this sort of the policy that US can sustain, Trump administration can sustain, for a long time? So I think then we're kind of getting into a lot of these potential other moving pieces that may not be evident at the time this decision might be made to quote unquote walk away, but that would become evident pretty shortly after that, which then itself kind of, makes the policy decision back in play, right? As opposed to sticking to it might become more politically costly than it may have been presented by administration to begin with.
This is absolutely fascinating. I was saying in the green room that one of the most interesting things, Tim, you and I were talking about this, about all this, is how it changes not just our view of the conflict and what's going to happen, but our view of the field and the world. What you guys are suggesting, and I love this, is there are these forces of political gravity, these structural features of the situation that are going to impose themselves on the choices of actors because there are limits to agency, and or rather in some areas there are not, and some areas there are. And so Trump has clearly, I would say, shown us vastly greater powers of agency and potential for agency than any of us would have expected. Right? The situation has changed more. American policy toward lots of other areas has changed more. But what I hear you guys saying is the revenge of the structures, the revenge of the environment, the revenge of the situation will start to impose itself on the administration because if you're going to exert this much agency, unless you create an entire new world quickly, it won't actually stick and you'll be pushed back. Is that what you guys are
Yeah,
both saying?
yeah, because I think Trump can, change tariffs with a stroke of a pen. There's a lot of decisions that depend solely on Donald Trump. This isn't one of them. And this isn't one where he has a lot of leverage. You know, he has very kind of blunt tools to use against the Russians. This notion that he's brought up, oh, we're going to use secondary sanctions if the Kremlin doesn't agree to our demands. Well, I mean, what does that even really mean? We going to sanction China and India for buying, Russian oil and gas? And is that, what is that going to accomplish? So like the threats are so towards Russia are so unclear and not well thought out that I'm not sure they're going to be effective. And on the Ukraine side, yeah, you can cut off aid, you can do all kinds of things. But as Oksana noted, Europe can step in, Ukraine can step in, and even in the US case, there's a political cost, if things go badly in Ukraine for the incumbent. So there's just a lot more that is out of the control of Trump than there is on some other issues.
Interesting. Okay, Oksana, do you agree with that
Oh,
basically?
I agree. I think it was well, Gideon, and I agree with what Tim just said. Yeah. The revenge of the structures. Yeah.
I like that. Okay, this is so interesting. I mean, again, it's horrible, but it's interesting because the structures for those who are not political scientists, structural forces in history don't come down like in a Monty Python cartoon with the big hand of God that pokes a candidate. Somebody did it. They operate through influencing the decisions of the actors. So you can always argue, why did they do something like that? But we all believe, I think, as social scientists, that there are these various features of the situation, environmental factors that men make choices, but not as they please, Marx said, under circumstances given to them. It's the opposite view of Carlyle, which is that the great men create history as they want. And what we're seeing here is a test. In some ways, agency has won the early rounds of the fight compared to what many of us would have expected in all sorts of areas. But what I hear you guys saying is that as the fight goes on, agency, if it doesn't win a knockout soon, will tire and structure will come back and land heavy blows in the later rounds of the fight.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if
Maybe
you
just
think,
saying sorry. Yeah.
no, go ahead, Oksana.
Very quickly, like one thing, just to to reinforce what you're saying and to add to it, I think sort of the tragedy and the problem with the current administration that is not thinking these ways, like as far as we can tell, right? Like this is sort of the thing where professional diplomats, people with expertise, people who know the region, right, people who worked in the government, actually like have this longer term perspective that could, I mean, nobody can perfectly predict it, but like knowledge matters, and you can say like these are the constraints that have been there from day one and that are still there, and they're going to manifest themselves. We can't just wish them away. And I'm not sure, based from what we've seen, that this administration really has this sort of brain power, or if it exists, that it's really having a causal impact on the actual decision making.
Well, but that's how it'll be interesting to see how and when structure imposes itself, even in that situation, right? It'll be
Yeah,
very interesting. I agree.
it's
Okay.
interesting to think about how Trump talks about U.S.-Russia relations. It's all about his personal relationship with Putin. I've got a good relationship with Putin, therefore we're going to, reset U.S.-Russian relations and have peace in Ukraine and all these other things. Putin and Xi have met at least 42 times. Putin and Trump, I think, have met 5 times. They've talked on the phone more than that. But we only get the view of that relationship from the Trump side.
Right.
We don't get the view of that relationship from the Russia side. So when
They
he
must be
says we have a
wondering, like,
great
is this a trap?
relationship,
This looks too
yeah,
good to be true. Is this a trap? That's what they're
yeah,
thinking. One last question before we
yeah,
turn
sure.
it over to our audience so they can grill you. Um, okay, let's go to Europe. The implication of what you guys just said is actually, if I'm Ukraine and if I'm Europe and I'm listening to you guys, I think to myself, I stay calm, stay cool, play rope a dope, wait this out, and come back and counterpunch a little bit later. It seems to me that like instead of saying, "Oh, the world order is over, the transatlantic order is over, we have to retaliate," like what you're suggesting is this isn't a permanent change in the world. This is a radical policy shift by a new administration that's heavily betting on some things without the cards to back it up. So you need to find a way to wait them out. If you're Europe, how do you respond to Trump?
Yeah,
Oksana.
well, I can start with just thinking out loud. I mean, first of all, I'm not even so sure. I mean, both Tim and I study authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, and I hear this a lot from many Americans that, oh, this is like temporary insanity, like in 4 years or maybe 2 years, we're going to be back to normal. I mean, as much as I'd like to hope so, I don't think there is any guarantee. I mean, this could be the beginning of sort of brave new age when American democracy, as we know it, is faltering. And so I'm not going to go into this because obviously I don't know what's exactly going to happen, but I would just sort of sound a note of caution that this kind of like, let's just wait and things are going to revert to what it has been before this presidential election. I am somewhat skeptical about this, right? And then I think for the Europeans, right? So I don't think they're just sitting there and waiting. I think they are actually very actively trying to think about how do they respond. Of course, with Europe, part of the problem is that in the EU, decision making has to be by consensus, and it's quite different group of countries. We have sort of more hawkish on Russia, right? We have Hungary, a sort of permanent spoiler. We have Southern Europeans that are maybe less, you kind of want to be engaged in these various ways. And I think the question here, to my mind, is like, first of all, would there be enough resolve in Europe to actually, for example, spend more money in defense when it might mean more money, less money on social services and stuff like that? And secondly, can it sort of feasibly be done in the short enough time frame, right, to be able to prop Ukraine and extent that it needs? And to me, it seems like I don't know, if I sort of put it briefly, but I think that this is something that Europeans are thinking about. And I think that's the right way of thinking. I don't think they're sort of doing nothing and kind of waiting and hoping for it to blow over would be a good strategy. I don't think that's what they're doing. But I think there is quite a bit, these are democratic countries, right? People want to have their, social security and social services and so forth. And if you start spending more in defense, money has to come out of somewhere, right? In the short term, like that may be politically costly for parties in power, like the way democratic systems work. But I think there is definitely, this commitment there, which, if you ask me, should have been developing since 2014. In a way, it's almost like Europeans are kind of waking up to it too late. But as they say, better late than never. And, given the sort of increased capacity on the Ukrainian side and this greater commitment on the European side, and some countries are acting unilaterally, Norway and others, to make these decisions, I am sort of cautiously optimistic that Europe can hold its own and support Ukraine, even if things continue to go badly here.
Okay, Tim, over to you. What's the
Yeah,
future of NATO?
so for a long time, I had been worried that the US pulling back on Ukraine would lead the Europeans to do the same. It would give them an excuse to do something that they wanted to do anyway, right? But I think that the Trump administration's disdain for Europe has shocked them so much that we might be getting the opposite effect now, where, yes, Oksana's right that, they're, not going to, have 4 or 5% spending on GDP, but I do think there is a recognition that Europe has to do a lot more because now they recognize they're on their own much more than ever before. So I saw something recently that, for the first time, Germany has made a commitment to station some of its troops on a permanent basis outside of Germany. They've sent German soldiers on temporary missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there will be a not at large, but a small group of German troops based in the Baltics that are supposed to be there as part of a NATO deployment, and that's a change. And Macron stepping up and talking a lot about French nuclear weapons, and Gideon wrote on this very theme about is there a French nuclear umbrella for Europe? Now I have no idea whether that's going to happen or not. Not likely, but just that there is even conversations about it is a different place than where we were, 6 months ago, or even actually 3.5 months ago before Trump, was in power, but before he was sworn in. So,
Will America be in NATO in 5 years?
yes.
Will it be active?
Define active.
Oksana, will any European country other than France and Britain have nuclear weapons in 10 years?
I don't know, but I think this is exactly the problem, right? With Ukraine and the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, you hear this argument being made over and over that that was a mistake, right, to denuclearize. And the assurances that Ukraine received turned out not to be worth paper that they're written on. So there is, at least narrative, right? I'm not privy to any kind of policy behind closed doors decision making, but I think it invites. I think the situation that we're in not prevents, but invites nuclear proliferation, because if countries conclude that alliances don't matter, right, that international treaties don't matter, that promises don't matter, and ultimately what matters is raw power. And what better way to prevent invasion of your country than to have a nuclear deterrence, right? Some saying Ukraine should develop nuclear weapons. I'm not saying that this will happen either for Ukraine or for other countries, but I think it is important to realize that it increases the threat of nuclear proliferation as opposed to decreases it.
Tim, thank you. I agree. Tim, in 10 years, what are the odds of a northern or eastern or German bomb in the basement?
Oh, I should be asking you this question,
Well, I'm trying to
given that
steal your guys'
you've written
analysis.
on
I
this
don't know.
recently.
I would bet
What did you say,
I
Gideon?
would
The
not
odds
at
of
all be
what? Bomb?
surprised. I would say within 10
I
years,
didn't understand what you asked.
I would say in 10 years, somebody other than UK and France will have a nuclear capacity, at least at the Japanese level.
Yeah. Poland, maybe?
Poland, Germany, Sweden, the Balts, the Nordics. Germany, no, for a whole lot of reasons, because they're not on the front line yet. It would take a Okay, actually, Oksana, actually, this was actually the last question of mine for both of you. Let's say the situation occurs as plays out roughly as you're talking about. Will Putin go beyond Ukraine, even if things do calm down eventually there, to attack um, the, uh, uh, the the Baltics or some other European country? You've made a good point that his ambitions are great in Ukraine and can't be satisfied in a partial kind of way. Does he have ambitions beyond Ukraine?
I
Yeah,
think if you listen to what he himself says, like he clearly, right, it's the whole sort of this global West and the values, the civilizational battle, Russia being entitled to special, zone of interest and so forth. I mean, would he actually, and here again, sort of like it's a moving, right, in a way, kind of contingent, rather, I want to say like it's a contingent story, right? But I think at the very least, if, say, Russia prevailed in Ukraine, I think it increases the chance that it could test NATO resolve in like this Suwalski Gap or whatever it's called near Kaliningrad, or in Estonia. Like if Trump is not, willing to commit to NATO and sort of defense of, alliance, France and Germany, like would they really go fighting for, Russian-speaking region in Estonia where they can have a referendum and say like everybody wants to be part of Russia, right? So I'm not necessarily saying this will happen in the near future, but I think if Ukraine were to be defeated and Russia were to achieve its goal there, I think this scenario becomes more likely as opposed to less likely. So I don't, and it, again, because of this narrative, sort of kind of the arc, like what it's, yes, Ukraine is central to this war and what Putin wants, but there is a broader, in the Russian worldview, there is a broader conflict there. That they're fighting, and that puts, I think, other countries in the at least in the Russian periphery, including NATO members, potentially in play.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
a different way to think about that is not that you would see, Russia engaging in a sneak attack on the Baltics to take more territory, but one could see Russian troops massing at the border, or Putin negotiating over the security architecture of Europe from a much stronger position if he is able to force Ukraine to capitulate and to declare that Russia is force to be reckoned with. So it doesn't necessarily have to be uh, through military means, but it would dramatically strengthen Putin's bargaining power in any kind of future discussions over the whether U.S. troops are going to be in Europe, what kinds of security arrangements are possible on the continent. So that's a different way of thinking about Putin's aims, that he would like to get a sphere of influence and do it as cheaply as possible without having to fight.
Okay. We are now
And I
going to
think
go.
it brings
Sorry, go,
Yeah,
Oksana.
just like very quickly, I think it also links back to your question about nuclear, right? Because if we think back, sort of this redoing security architecture, the last thing before the invasion, right, that Putin demanded that US rejected was for US to conclude this agreement with Russia, which would basically NATO would withdraw from Central Europe, right, from Poland, from so essentially security of these countries was something that Russia wanted to negotiate over and sovereignty over their heads with US directly, right? And I agree with Tim that if sort of it came to that. And if this was the conversation, then, all of these countries, Poland and others, like if there is no NATO kind of security anymore, de facto, maybe even if it's on paper, if US is no longer committed, everybody's out for themselves, the nuclear thing becomes much more sort of, plausible way to answer this security dilemma that they would find themselves in.
I agree. Okay, this is great. By the way, if anybody's interested in the proliferation question, I put in the chat a link to the article that Tim mentioned, basically why we should expect Trump's securities policies to spur proliferation, which essentially is why John Mearsheimer was right about Ukrainian nukes and de Gaulle was right about extended deterrence, which are things I would never, ever have thought I would say, which is shocking to me. Okay, we're now going to go to some questions from the audience. And the first one is directly right to you, Oksana, on this, or to both of you. Why is the U.S. having negotiations with Russia directly and not including Ukraine in the talks? Is it something, is it, why is it? Why are they dealing with Russia directly rather than and excluding Ukraine and Europe? Either of you.
I think this is, Tim, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, like what kind of Trump goals are and how he thinks. And I think this is one maybe illustration that this great power that of big boys deciding for other unimportant countries, like that's part of it, right? It comes from sort of lack of knowledge of foreign affairs. We can say disregard. I mean, forget Ukraine. I mean, they want to annex Canada and they're telling them how they, it's in the Canadian interest. So I think it's related kind of that you have big important countries and then all of these unimportant countries, and Ukraine falls in the category of the not important. And if they think they can do a deal with Russia over Ukraine's head, Trump would have no qualms about it. Of course, the problem is going back to structure and reasons. Ukrainians have agency and like they're just not going to be, like walked over in a way, but that doesn't mean that Trump realizes this. So I think to my mind, like this kind of direct Trump with Putin over Ukraine, signifies how he views the world.
I think this is
And there
great,
are
by the way, and
examples.
this is great, and this is where where structure meets agency is where it gets interesting, because it can happen. Tim, do you agree with that? Could we have other questions if you have
Yeah,
any?
General Kellogg has said that they wanted to keep the Ukrainians and the Europeans out because it's much easier to make a bilateral deal than it is to make a multilateral deal. That was the explanation going back to
God,
nine
they're
months
such
ago.
morons. But don't they
Yeah.
realize that they to end it they have to have a bilateral
Yes.
deal?
And actually the
Multilateral?
way the ceasefire, quote unquote, deal broke down was the classic example of why setting up talks in this way, where none of the parties had a common agreement about what they had just agreed upon. And, it just quickly fell apart. It was like a game of game of telephone, where, people are just passing on what they thought the agreement was about when, other side, had a completely different understanding.
Okay, Oksana, this is from Beverly Zelensky. Do you think President Zelensky and the government in Ukraine are seriously thinking of accepting the terms of Trump's minerals deal?
Yeah, see, the minerals deal is tricky because on the one hand, Zelensky himself proposed this idea even before Trump floated it, right? That was part of the peace plan, like whatever it's called, peace formula, right? But then I think what Ukraine has in mind that it is something that at least they get something out of it, right? And these are not the terms in the latest iteration. It seems like, there have been now multiple iterations of this deal. And the last iteration is so exploitative that I don't see Ukrainians just signing on this. At the same time, of course, they are in a very unenviable situation because Trump already threatened them if you walk away from the deal, like very bad things will happen. And what I am seeing, it seems like they're trying to sort of tone it down and negotiate on the specifics. So they're not saying we don't want it. The deal is pretty terrible, right? That the Financial Times thing published last week. But they're saying, okay, like let's keep talking, like we are open to the deal. And I think this is sort of the question becomes, would it get potentially sort of bogged down / dragged out into some negotiation where the Trump team is open to, negotiating terms that would still be good for the US, but at least Ukraine gets something out of it? Or would they just be like, okay, you sign on the dotted line or else, and then if Ukrainians refuse, right, then there are very bad consequences for Ukraine. It seems like from what we've seen so far that there is some engagement. I think Ukrainian and American negotiators just yesterday or the day before were negotiating on Skype, or maybe even a team flew to the US to negotiate. So it seems like there is some, potential for maybe an agreement there that would, both sides could say they get something out of it. But I think the kinds of terms that were proposed to Ukraine in this most recent iteration, I don't see how Ukrainian government can just sign that.
Okay. Tim, do you have anything to add to that? You were just nodding.
No, yeah, I think that's right. We did some survey research in Ukraine where, if you have a peace agreement that doesn't include a security guarantee, it's tough to get a majority support for it. But if you have some kind of security guarantee, it could be NATO, it could be even not NATO. We said, some kind of security guarantee that was short of NATO, then you get, 60, 70%, agreeing. So a minerals deal that is just a way to repay the aid that was already delivered to Ukraine. I just don't see how that goes down in Ukraine.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. Okay. Next question from Chuck Kane about China. What is the role? China has played a major role in the war in terms of being the supplier of weapons to Russia. Will that continue? And what's China's angle in all this?
Yeah, well, this is where, I think the US role in global affairs looms large because it's easier now for China to be less friendly with the US as the US becomes increasingly isolated. So, China has a complicated relationship with Moscow. They've, uh, you know, won't stab Russia in the back, but they also recognize there are things that they don't agree on. They compete in Central Asia for influence. China has in the past said that they're too an Arctic power. And, China has its own interests in the global south that are in competition with Russia. So it's not a straightforward relationship. But to the extent that, the US is seen as an unreliable partner globally, that only strengthens China's hand and makes it easier for them to side with Russia.
Okay. This is from Lee Wheaton, will this become a 20 or 30-year war? In other words,
Mhm.
we've talked about how like it's already more protracted than most expected at the beginning. You guys called the reasons why it was likely to keep chugging along. And you haven't really changed your tune in the last several one of these talks we've had. And I've been sort of skeptical, but then you've been proven right by events. So, how long will these structural things continue? Are we actually talking about, I mean, are we going to go to a frozen conflict, or is it going to change in some major way, or will we be having this damn kind of conversation for many, many years to come?
Well, the US didn't recognize the Baltic states when they were part of the Soviet Union for almost 50 years. There's an armistice in Korea, right? That is still very much an armed situation. Those are the kind of outliers. One would hope that um, uh, change within Russia, I think, is the way to get a peace that would be longer lasting than an armed peace where there are security guarantees and deterrence kicks in and there's a disputed area that is patrolled, a DMZ of I don't know, it's such a large area. So if we're thinking about what is going to bring stability to the region, Putin won't live forever. And if we're thinking longer term, I think that's something that we don't think enough about. Um, is what happens to Russia domestically if Putin wins, and what happens to Russia domestically if it's a draw or people begin to recognize how costly this has been for not a particularly great prize.
Also, what happens if Putin doesn't live, actually? And it's
Yeah,
interesting how many, or leaders don't live. It's
yeah,
scary to look back and think how many times that kind of thing matters.
yeah.
Whether
Mhm.
it's whether it's the Mongol leader dying and then like the whole thing being called off. Whether it's Catherine. Well, Alexander the set was it Peter? Who was it? Who was the Russian leader who died? Was it Catherine?
Oh,
And the miracle of the House of Brandenburg when Peter it was in 18. Christ,
Nicholas, well,
Frederick the
Alexander the
Great.
Second,
Yeah. No, 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 it wasn't Alexander. It was like Peter the Third. Frederick the Great was basically about to lose, and I think it was Catherine died, and Peter the Third came in, and he was pro German, and he pulls
Mhm.
his forces away. But
Yeah,
this kind of stuff happens anyway. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so we've talked about a lot of these things here. Oh, we have one question here, Oksana, a Belarus question. We haven't brought Belarus in. Is Belarus the next in line? What is the role of Belarus in all this? And are they next up on the chopping block, or are their status going to change in any way?
Well, I think this is sort of the question of the broader implications of this war, and more specifically, broader implications of how this war might end, right? Because if the war were to end with some sort of like settlement that say did not like that Ukraine remains sovereign, that Russia is at least contained, or there is some kind of broader agreement, I think that puts this, in other words, that Russia doesn't claim victory, right? I think that does potentially threaten these authoritarian regimes along Russian periphery that have been backed by Russia, right? But including Belarus. So some sort of like regime opening in Belarus becomes more likely, not to say that it would be certain, but certainly becomes more likely, right? If Russia is denied its goals in Ukraine. And by contrast, if Russia prevails in Ukraine, I think like, all of these what happens in Georgia, what happens in Belarus, even Moldova potentially, right? We're looking at a different set of probabilities and possibilities. So again, there are consequences of this Russia-Ukraine war for the neighborhood, which would be, to my mind, at least very different, depending, if the war ends, say, with, sovereign Ukraine being maintained, even potentially, with this territory it doesn't control de facto, or if Russia is essentially prevails in Ukraine and destroys, Ukrainian statehood, or creates some puppet regime, what they've been wanting to do. So I would say sort of Belarus is in play this way.
Yeah, let's combine the last two questions. What if Lukashenko has a heart attack tomorrow, right? Well, that would be a very unstable situation and a very
But would
volatile.
it be really, like, would it be because I think this is again this question you're asking
Yeah,
earlier, Gideon, like what if Putin dies, right? I mean, the
yeah,
very fact that we are discussing this, it tells us something about what kind of regimes we're talking
yeah,
about, right? Because if we say like in Germany, the chancellor died tomorrow, like it's
yeah,
not going to be dramatically like things
yeah,
will
yeah,
change, right? But if you have a democratic system with institutional pathways of making policy, with a system of checks and balances, individual just by definition in these structural conditions is less important. In place like Russia and Belarus, individual is very important, right? But also these individuals create certain systems that, I mean,
yeah,
again, I'm not an expert on Belarus, but my understanding is that the security service, the KGB, which is still called KGB, and all of this have been very strongly institutionalized, kind of any dissidence is purged. So it is quite likely you're going to have sort of inter-elite turnover, and somebody like Lukashenko number two, maybe Russia would send somebody like that they
yep,
would consider acceptable, right? And the same in Russia. Again, we know, I mean, I feel like we know so little because the regime progressively became both personalistic and more close.
yeah,
That what is really the story in this internal ruling circle? Like, would, I don't know, Patrushev step in? Like, is there Putin double? There is all this discussion that there are like six Putins, right? And maybe Putin is already dead.
yeah.
And so I guess what I'm saying that even though like I take your point and I generally agree that I think something as dramatic as death of a leader, say like in Ukraine if Zelensky died, I think there would be all sorts of political potential consequences. But at the same time, when these personalized dictatorships have been entrenched for such a long time, they also create these sort of circles of succession that somebody not that dissimilar might take over, be it Russia or Belarus, and there may not be that much change.
I
And the
remember
and the
there was an old
quantitative studies prove Oksana's point that the death of a leader rarely has an impact on a regime change. But the Belarus case might be, given its strategic importance, one could spin all kinds of scenarios about Russian intervention and
maybe not regime change, but policy, it does. If you think
yeah,
actually, and I've been thinking, we've been talking a lot about the Korea analogy in terms of the Ukraine over the years. And one of the things that I just started thinking about that I hadn't considered before, it was odd. Stalin's death creates the potential for the ultimate peace in Korea. Soviet policy changes after Stalin dies, and they begin to be able to accept the peace that's ultimately the armistice that's negotiated later in the spring and summer. If Stalin doesn't die, what the hell would have happened with Ukraine, with Korea, is actually a scenario I hadn't thought about. But like, I can see if Putin dies, I can see the next government staying Putin-esque, but settling the war, for example. But they're interesting things.
yeah.
Okay. By the way, Oksana, you talked about the institutionalization. This gets to the question we talked about. We would have said up until 2 months ago that the US was a highly institutionalized, mature democracy in which there were procedures and bureaucracies and power centers, and that no individual president could change policy at will on multiple issues, that they would never do things like bring on a recession, that they wouldn't flip to the Russia side in a war at this, they wouldn't go. We would have said that was impossible in our institutionalized system, and yet it's happened, which to me shows again the latent power of the president in our system, or maybe in any system. But then the question becomes, will the broader structural constraints, the constitutional constraints, hold with elections here? That's an interesting question. I know there's all the stuff you guys talked about. I mean, there was a contradiction, but not a contradiction. But I think you guys, Tim, do you see any danger of U.S. democracy being fundamentally compromised over the long term, the way Oksana worries about a little bit?
Look, I think it was compromised on January 10th, 2021. I think that is the root of a lot of what we're seeing today. If we look at South Korea, Brazil, France, you have leaders who violated laws, who tried to overturn elections or have a coup, and the political system were able to deal with them. Whereas I think in our system, it was a great failure to deal with a fundamental challenge to the most basic principle of democracy. So once that gives way, I think that opens the door to all kinds of changes. Um, so so
I
yes,
was
I'd
getting
like to
triggered by
be.
you guys. Now you're
I
getting
know
now
I'd like
you're
to
very-
be, and I'm an optimist by nature. Um, uh,
No, I think the jury is still out on the US democracy
yes.
because one of the things that safeguards the judicial system, right? Because once we reach a point, which some say we're already fast approaching and maybe even beginning to reach, when the judicial decisions are disregarded by the executive, like that's a calling card of a non-democratic regime, right? And I think in the US, like, I mean, first of all, the fact that president is so consequential, it's not really that surprising because it is a strong, president has a lot of powers institutionalized. So it's not that like a Czech Republic where there is president that has no powers. So US president by definition is meant to be important player, right? But really the question is once, decisions are made by the executive that the courts find in violation of, rules, procedures, constitutional norms, what have you, what happens then, right? Is the executive essentially responding, like, or is the judiciary going to be ignored and potentially even subjugated, as it has been in many authoritarian countries in the part of the world Tim and I study? That's one of the first things autocrats do when they come to power. They want to destroy independent courts.
I mean,
So
a different
I
way
mean,
to,
like,
yeah.
we've had pretty pessimistic discussion, but I want to say, like, I think the jury is still out there on this in the US.
See, I think the U.S. case, I think, Oksana's right. And I think that's what everyone's paying attention to is, will the Trump administration abide by a Supreme Court decision, or even federal court decision that they don't like? But there's a subtler and sneakier problem if the Supreme Court allows the executive to basically usurp authority from other branches of government just through judicial reasoning, because there's a coalition on the Supreme Court that is fine with an executive that is able to violate what many people would regard as democratic norms, or to respect checks and balances. Like the really scary case is if the Supreme Court says everything's okay and the Trump administration is able to usurp power with a seal of approval from the Supreme Court rather than by running roughshod over it. That's a really pessimistic scenario, which, and I, I
now you
don't,
guys are getting, and now you're making me scared again. You were making me sort of happy that structure would come back and restore things onto a more sensible path. But now you're
but
freaking me out.
there's also federalism. I mean, there's also the U.S. has a lot of guardrails that other countries don't have. So I don't want to be ultimately so pessimistic, but the courts and federalism, I think, are two things that are still in U.S. favor. And even look, we had an election in Wisconsin for a Supreme Court. One side won, the other side conceded, immediately, and that's all a good sign. So
Are
take
you
the
guys
small
following?
victories where you can.
Are
So
you guys following Tim Snyder and Marcy Shore to Toronto?
I'm not going anywhere. Although, you know, one fantasizes.
Then
One
Toronto
last
might
question.
become,
Sorry,
51st
what?
state, right? I'm saying Canada might become the next state, so
Yeah.
following to Toronto might not solve the problems.
In my most
of this.
pessimistic moments, I joke we can't move all our universities to Vienna, which is the Central European University solution when Orban tried to shut them down as they moved from Budapest to Vienna. So I think the universities are going to have to stay here. The Vienna's not big enough for all the Ivies to move there, and Tufts too, which has been in the news as well. So.
Actually, let me take a question just on the academy front. Um, this is not related to Ukraine, but it's sort of related to Ukraine because you guys are both part of multinational scholarly epistemic communities that are clearly global. The US, the administration's campaign against international travel, against letting people into the country, its immigration enforcement stuff, will this deal a significant blow to the U.S. academic conference, the international conference business, or the professional organization businesses? Are the organizations intellectual and academic that you guys belong to internationally less likely to have, close U.S. ties than they were before? Are we really
Absolutely.
seeing a
Yeah.
sort of spread of the world?
Yeah. I mean,
I just,
mo
go ahead.
Oksana, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
So, I mean, one thing we're really worried about is we have a lot of foreign students and they typically pay full freight. So if you take away the revenue that's generated by foreign students, both at the M.A. and the undergraduate level, that's a really substantial chunk in a just pure kind of gross material sense. But the thing that makes academia great is it's a global market. It's a global market for human capital. I mean, I'm hazarding a guess right now. A third of my colleagues in my departments were born outside the United States and, grew up outside the United States. A good chunk of my students, I think 20% of Columbia students live outside the United States. That's a pretty substantial, but just intellectually, it would be a much poorer place if these kind of international ties break down.
Right,
Uh,
but I guess what I'm saying is, do you see them breaking down?
I would speak to that question
yeah.
exactly. I personally already see that because I'm, for example, involved in organizing of two international conferences in the next, 6 months or so, and we already see that we have colleagues in other countries who are wary about traveling to the U.S. Because of the uncertainty that some
Mhm.
academics have been detained on the border, deported, what have you. So there is now conversation, even sort of like just limited to a conference, like what do we do? Do we create a virtual sort of, convention in addition to the in-person convention? How do you even budget, and all of these things? So I think this is happening. And I mean, I second everything that Tim said. And just sort of additional impact on the academia is in all this grant funding, right? And this is again, like in the way that it works in the US, a lot of innovation not only in social sciences, but in medical sciences, right, and hard science is done at the university. So it's like if you start taking money away, so it's not just, that whoever takes money is in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies are finding about Israel and Palestine. I mean, people are doing, because that's what's driving it, but really the affected across the board are, academic projects that have very practical benefits for health sciences, for natural sciences, for all sorts of things. And again, sort of the academia becomes poorer, but I think also our well-being, kind of broadly speaking, would be adversely affected. And if you add to it, to Tim's point, academia being global, brain drain out of America, right? Like people don't want to work in these conditions. And there's already, I mean, I hear in the news that West European universities are trying to recruit American academics. So the fallout, for intellectual life, but also for these very practical benefits to society, I think would be very dire. And we are, admittedly at an early stage of this, maybe some of it can be reversed. But I think there is, oftentimes not realization that these are also the implications given how the academic system here is structured.
Who overcomes collective action dilemmas first and rises to the ability to defend themselves? European nations or American elite universities?
The European nations to rally against Russia, or elite universities to band together.
Yeah, who
So at
organizes
least,
successfully first?
I mean, they have the European Union, right? So there is an institutional framework
Not for
that,
defense and security.
not for defense and security, to be sure. Um,
Oksana was talking about the difficulty of overcoming the collective action dilemmas,
and
European defense policy.
I'm not, decisions at Columbia were made above my pay grade, but I know from what I understand, there were considerable efforts by Columbia to create a united front, and those efforts were unsuccessful. So I would like to think that we would be able to overcome them, but our past experience has not given given much hope. But this is a long game, so we'll have to see how this all plays out.
Actually, I said early on, you guys, when we first started doing these, you checked my enthusiasm that the situation might change and the war might end, and it depressed my optimism. In the last couple of ones, you've made the same kinds of points, and that has checked my pessimism a little bit. So I am confident, somewhat confident now that ironically, we'll probably be doing this in the fall, in the situation that may not look nearly as different from where it does today as many people would expect. Is that a fair prediction? What do you think?
You're saying the situation will be
Well,
the
the
same? What were you
situation
saying,
is
Didier?
it quite is what are the odds that the situation in the fall will not look dramatically different than it does today?
Fall is not that far away, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's 6 months.
So no Russian breakthrough on the battlefield.
No Russian
No,
breakthrough, no full no peace deal, no full U.S. abandonment.
yeah, I
Sounds
think
plausible.
that sounds like a pretty plausible.
Wow. Again,
It's also though the milk toast safest argument for people in our position to make. Yes, the future will look a lot like today, and
oh, but that's actually plausible until it
yeah,
changes. When I
yeah.
was I'll close with this. When I was at the NSC in the mid '90s, I met an old CIA guy at a White House Christmas party, and he asked, "How are things going on?" And I was in the NSC staff, a junior guy doing Middle East policy, and he said, "What's going on with Iraq?" And I said, "Oh my God, we don't know whether the sanctions will collapse or Saddam will fall, and the only question is which will come first." And he was like, "Uh-huh, uh-huh," I said, which do he said, you want to bet? And I said, what do you mean? Which side do you want? He said, oh, I'll take status quo. I said, you didn't hear me. Either Saddam's going to fall or the sanctions will collapse. He said, the only question is which. And he said, yeah, I heard you. Uh, how about $20,
Mm,
this time next year situation? I'll take the middle. You could have both ends of the
yeah.
tail. And I said, I don't want to take your money, but I'm happy to. And I met the guy at the next Christmas party, and he held his hands out. I took out a 20 and I gave him the 20. And he said, you want to re-up the bet? And I said, "No, I've learned my lesson." And he said, "Good. That's what I was trying to teach you. These things can continue for much longer than you think." Another friend of mine in the agency said, I said, "When's Saddam going to end?" He said, "Look, Saddam Hussein will not meet a natural death. He will not die of disease in his bed. But at any given moment, the best bet is that he's going to protect himself and will still be in power and still be alive. And that bet will continue to
Yeah.
be the right one until it doesn't happen." So your guys' bet on the stability of the situation playing out in Ukraine has been the right bet and will be so. Maybe you'll catch it when it turns, but so far this looks really good. Oksana Shevel, Timothy Frye, everybody at the NFRPP, let me thank you all. Let me turn you back to Jenny. Thank you for another great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. A really great conversation. Oksana, Timothy, and Gideon, thank you. Your studied perspectives help our audience form their own opinions, and we are grateful for your wisdom and expertise. I think we all hope that this will be the final NFRPP Ukraine update and that peace will come to Ukraine. Only time will tell. Regardless, we always welcome you back to continue the conversation. And Gideon has already said that you'll be back. So there you go. Um, so thank you, thank you, thank you. As a final
Once,
note, go ahead.
no, I'm just
Yes.
saying that we will be back. Yeah, we've been.
Okay, good, good. As a final note, we want to hear your thoughts on the programs that you would like to see in the coming months. Please send your ideas to info@nfrpp.org. Please sign up for our newsletter to learn about upcoming programs. In the next few days, this program will be available as a video on our website to share with your friends, on social media, or in your classrooms. Our next program is Wednesday, April 23rd at 7:30 p.m. We'll discuss the state of climate change and the environment from the perspective of business and government with an eye toward the objectives of the new administration. We hope to see you then. Gideon, Oksana, and Timothy, thank you again, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.